I'd been walking the docks for 3 hours when I spotted the old man standing beside a fishing boat that had untijo quadufai seen better days. My feet hurt in boots that were falling apart, and the 27 turndasu sin Pete Mirondum levant my wallet was everything I had left after losing my apartment last week. The harbor smelled like diesel fuel and oik guanon's feet rotting fish, but it might as well have been paradise if it meant finding work. Puinawiris. The boat looked sturdy, even though it was old. White paint peeled from the hull in long strips, and rust stains ran pot 30 down from the anchor chains, but the engine housing looked well maintained. A hand-painted sign on U-36, the back read, Maria's Dream in faded blue letters. The man checking lines near Goku Fiordiine, the front, had to be the captain. He moved around the deck like someone who knew what he was doing. I walked up White 50 slowly, not wanting to seem too eager. These guys can tell when you're desperate. 3 other boats had already, White 57 turned me down today, and my confidence was as low as my bank account. Excuse me, I called out. You hiring any crew? Hagyoman, Datsu Gwags he looked up from coiling rope, and I got my first good look at him. The man was probably in his 60s with really 112 wrinkled skin from being in the sun all the time. His gray hair was cut short, mostly covered by an old captain's hat. 20, I noticed his eyes right away. Pale blue and alert like he was always watching. 25 everything. Around him. Depends, he said, straightening up. You got Woman 31 experience? Some. I'd worked on a salmon boat in Alaska for 2 seasons, though, Mont 36, that was 5 years ago. Mostly dock work recently, but I know my way around Nets 142 and lines. He looked me over for a while, noticing my worn clothes and how 47 desperate I probably seemed. Most captains would have asked for references, wanted to know my 154 background, maybe even run a quick background check. This guy, just 159, nodded. Robert Campbell, he said, extending a callous hand. Cap, to most, 2.06 folks. Michael Torres. Mike. His grip was firm with the kind of strength that C2 came from hauling nets and fighting weather. You available to leave tomorrow? Morning. 2 weeks out, fishing the 219 waters west of Newport. The relief hit me so hard I nearly forgot to answer. 25. Yes, absolutely. Pays decent, food and bunk included. He named a figure that 231 would cover my debts and maybe even let me find a new place when we got back. Works hard, hours are long, and I run A238 tight ship. That's fine by me. Cap nodded and walked toward the wheelhouse. I followed, E4 expecting him to show me around the boat or explain the job duties. Instead, he disappeared inside for a minute, and 2.1 emerged with a folded piece of paper. Before we shake on anything, you need to read this, he said, handing it over. 59. The paper felt normal enough, just notebook paper torn from a spiral pad. But when I unfolded it, my stomach sank a little. Written in careful block letters were 5 numbered rules. 1. 3.13 Never look at the water between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. 2. If someone knocks on the cabin door during those 20 hours, do not answer. 3. If the boat stops moving for no reason, remain calm and continue your work. 4. If you see a woman in a white dress walking on the 333 water, go below deck immediately. 5. If something attacks the boat, hide 338 until it stops. I read through the list twice, waiting for Cap to crack a smile or 3, 4 to explain the joke. He just watched me with those pale eyes, his expression completely serious. This is, I started. He then stopped. The smart thing would be to hand the paper back and walk away. But $27 and no place to sleep made smart 4 point. Choice is a luxury I couldn't afford. Some kind of hazing thing for new crew. No 406 hazing on my boat, Cap said flatly. Those rules keep you alive out there. Part 12 follow them exactly. No exceptions. The way he said it sent an uncomfortable chill down my back. His 4.19 voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, like he was discussing navigation charts or weather patterns CD 25 instead of what sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. "The woman in the white dress," I said. 31, trying to keep my tone. "Light, that's a real thing I might see. Might probably 4.37 will if we're out long enough." Cap's expression didn't change. "Point is, when 4:42 you see her, you get below deck. Don't talk to her. Don't wave. Don't try to help. Just get out of sight." I folded, for 250, the paper and looked around the harbor. Other boats rocked in their slips, their crews busy with regular fishing prep. Petita nobody else seemed to be talking about. Supernatural encounters or mysterious women walking on water. "Look, Cap, I-5 Co-Row need this job," I said. "If following some rules is part of the deal, then fine. But you're talking about this stuff like 5.20. What it's real, because it is real." He pulled a battered watch from his pocket and .16 checked the time. "You'll understand soon enough." The matter-of-fact way he said it, 5.21, was almost worse than if he'd been ranting or dramatic about it. He had clearly spent decades at sea and knew 5.28 boats and weather and all the practical realities of commercial fishing. Yet he was handing me a list that belonged in A535 by Ghost Story. "So, do we have a deal?" Cap asked. I looked at the paper again. Then 42 at the boat. That was my only chance to pay my bills. The rules were weird, sure, but they weren't asking me to do 5.49 anything illegal or dangerous. Just avoid looking at water during certain hours and hide if attacked by mysterious 58 creatures. Easy enough to humor an old fisherman's superstitions. "Yeah," I said, "we have a 6.05 deal." Cap nodded and shook my hand again. "Good. Be here at 5 a.m. sharp, 6, 8, and 11. We'll load supplies and head out with the tide." He walked back toward the wheelhouse, then Kueninus paused. "Mike, keep that list on you. Don't lose it. Don't leave it in your 6.23 bunk. Those rules are the difference between coming home and ending up another missing person scene. 29 report." I saw him go into the wheelhouse and I was left standing on the dock. I-634 really needed this job, but I felt like I'd just signed up for something. Weirder than regular fishing. I folded the paper he had 41 and put it in my jacket pocket. Tomorrow, I'd be on a boat with a captain who somehow believed in 6.47 supernatural women and monsters. But at least for now, I had a job and would get paid. I headed back to town, thinking quite a vitamin 5 about what to do before my shift started. The rules seemed silly, but they were Cap's rules, and he was paying .0 Kurmi to follow them. How hard could it be to play along with an old man's ghost stories for 2 weeks? I'd gotten into the 7/8 rhythm of life aboard the Maria's Dream faster than I expected. The work kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. Hauling to 50 nets, sorting, catch, maintaining equipment. Each day blended into the next when you're at sea, where the sun's 7.22 position mattered more than any clock. Cap ran the boat exactly like he'd set suit in 27 promised. Everything had its place. Every task had its proper sequence. He 7.33 showed me how to read the fish finder, how to set the nets at different depths depending on what we were targeting. My 7.39 hands got new calluses from handling rope and tackle, and the salt air started feeling normal instead of harsh, 46. But I noticed things about Cap that didn't quite add up. Every evening around 1:45, he'd start checking his 7.54 watch more frequently. He'd check more and more often as 2 got closer. 15 every few minutes, then every minute, then constantly. At exactly 2 a.m., he'd Otofor disappear below deck and wouldn't come back until 5 a.m. on the dot. During those 3 hours, the boat was on 8.10 autopilot while I took the night watch alone. The first few times I figured he was catching up on sleep or handling Point 17 paperwork. Captains had administrative duties that probably worked better without crew members around. But by the 8.23 night, I realized something was off. When Cap came back up at 5 a.m., he looked exhausted rather than rested. 30, his eyes had dark circles, and he moved carefully like someone recovering from a bad night. "You okay?" I asked one 8:39 morning as he emerged from below, looking particularly worn down. "Fine," 8:44 he said, checking his watch again before starting the coffee. "Just have trouble sleeping, Heath, sometimes." During those exact same 3 hours every night, Cap paused in 8:55 measuring coffee grounds. Insomnia's got its own schedule. I find it easier to read down in my cabin during the worst of it rather than toss around in my bunk. The explanation sounded reasonable. 9. Oh, Sven, enough, but it didn't match what I observed. I never saw any books in his county cabin when I passed by during the day. No reading lamp, no stack of magazines. 18, and the exhaustion on his face each morning looked less like someone who'd been reading and more like someone who'd .24 been fighting to stay awake. More concerning was how religiously he stuck to those exact times. I'd worked with plenty of guys who had sleep problems, and none of them vanished like clockwork for exactly 3 hours every single night. 38 Cap's schedule was so precise I could set my watch by it. By the 7th 43 night, the rules started feeling less like a captain's weird superstitions and 49 more like something he actually believed. The way he checked his watch, the deliberate timing, the 9:55 exhaustion, it all pointed to someone following a protocol rather than dealing with ordinary and in tune. Oh, insomnia. I found myself thinking about that folded paper in my jacket pocket more often. Rule 1 kept running, 10, 8:09 through my head. Never look at the water between a.m. and 5 a.m. What could 10:15 possibly happen to ocean water during those specific hours? That would require a rule. On the 8th night, my 10:23 curiosity finally got the better of my common sense. Cap disappeared. Below deck at 2 saws, exactly same as always. I 10:31 waited until 2:15, then quietly made my way up to the main deck. The boat moved .37 steadily through calm seas under a half-moon that provided plenty of visibility. 42 everything eu edure. Our wake trailed behind the boat in a straight white line. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Just ocean water doing what ocean water does. I walked to the port rail and looked down at the waves. They rolled past in their regular rhythm, formed by wind and current like they had for millions of years. The sound was hypnotic. Water rushing against the hull. The distant sound of foam breaking. Then the pattern changed. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The waves seemed to be forming different shapes, organizing themselves into something that wasn't quite random anymore. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The water began to change more dramatically. Instead of normal swells, the surface started rising and falling in long, regular ridges. But these weren't wave formations. They were too symmetrical, too purposeful. As I watched, the ridges grew more pronounced, developing distinct edges. That's when I realized they looked like teeth, massive teeth, each one easily the size of our boat, rising from the ocean floor in parallel rows that stretched beyond the horizon. The water hadn't disappeared. It had become something else entirely. What I was looking at wasn't the Pacific Ocean anymore. It was the inside of some enormous mouth, and our boat was sitting right in the middle of it. The teeth began moving, grinding against each other with a sound like mountains colliding. The grinding created vibrations I could feel through the deck of the boat. A rhythmic pulse. Water, if it was still water, flowed between the teeth like saliva, carrying bright foam that glowed with sickly green light. Then came the whispers. They started, quietly, almost below my hearing threshold, just a rustling sound that could have been wind or waves. But as the grinding grew louder, the whispers became more distinct. Voices, thousands of them, all speaking, in languages I couldn't understand. They overlapped and mixed until the sound became a mess of urgent communication. The voices weren't random chatter. They were trying to tell me something important, something I needed to know. I found myself leaning further over the rail, straining to make out individual words. The grinding teeth made a deep sound underneath the whispers as this impossible conversation continued. Part of my mind recognized that I should be terrified. The rational part understood that what I was seeing couldn't be real, that oceans don't transform into mouths and water doesn't speak in alien languages. But terror felt distant and unimportant compared to the overwhelming need to understand what the voices were saying. I realized I was holding my breath. My hands gripped the rail so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every muscle in my body had locked up while my brain tried to process the impossible scene below. The boat continued its steady course through what had become a living throat, carrying us deeper into whatever this thing was. The whispers grew more insistent, rising in pitch and volume. Individual voices started breaking through the chaos, speaking directly to me in words that almost made sense. They knew my name. They knew why I was here. They had been waiting for someone like me to finally look at them during the forbidden hours. That's when I felt hands grab my shoulders and yanked me backward. "What the hell are you doing?" Cap's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. He dragged me away from the rail and toward the cabin hatch, his grip strong enough to leave bruises. He tried to explain what I'd seen, but my voice wouldn't work. The words came out as croakas and gasps, while I pointed back toward the water. Cap didn't look. He kept his eyes on my face while he pulled me toward the hatch. "Don't talk," he said. "Don't look back. Just get below deck right now." He practically shoved me down the ladder into the cabin and slammed the hatch behind us. The sudden change from the weird scene above to the normal inside of the boat left me confused and shaking. Cap led me to a chair and moved around the cabin, checking locks and tying down anything that wasn't already secured. "You looked at the water," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, finally finding my voice. "Cap, there's something out there. The ocean." It changed into something else. There were teeth and voices. "I know what you saw." His tone was flat and furious. "That's exactly why I gave you those rules. That's exactly why you're supposed to follow them." The whispers could still be heard through the hall, though muffled now. They sounded angry at being interrupted, frustrated that their talk had been cut short. Cap went to a storage locker and pulled out what looked like a portable radio, though the sounds it made when he turned it on were more like static mixed with white noise. "This helps block them out," he explained, adjusting the volume until the whispers faded. "They don't like interference." I sat in the chair trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still shaking, and I kept expecting the boat to lurch or tilt as those massive teeth closed around us. But the engine kept making its steady noise, and the boat stayed on track like nothing weird had just happened. "What was that thing?" I asked. Cap checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. He had over 2 hours left before he could safely return to the deck. "That's what lives underneath." He said it's always been there, but during those 3 hours, it gets close enough to the surface that you can see it. Most people who look at it never come back. The rules keep you alive. Cap's anger was starting to fade, replaced by the exhaustion I'd seen every morning. Every single one of them exists because someone before you learned the hard way what happens when you ignore them. He settled into another chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "I should have explained this better. Should have made sure you understood that this wasn't some kind of game." The radio static filled the silence between us. Outside, I could hear the ocean returning to its normal sound. Regular waves against the hull instead of the strange noises from before. But I knew that what I'd Scene was still down there, waiting for the next person to break the first rule. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. 20 years, Cap said. "Ever since my first captain showed me the same list he gave you. He didn't explain it either, just told me to follow the rules or die. I thought he was crazy until I made the same mistake you just made." He looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A deep, bone-deep tiredness that came from carrying knowledge too heavy for one person. The difference is, I had someone to pull me back before I fell in. He continued, "You're lucky I came looking for you when I did." I thought about that moment at the rail, how I couldn't stop listening to those whispers. If Cap hadn't grabbed me, would I have climbed over? Would I have dropped into that weird opening to join whatever was talking from below? "Why do you do this?" I asked. "Why keep fishing waters that have that thing in them?" Cap glanced at his watch again. "Because the fish are good, the money's better, and someone needs to know how to navigate these waters safely. There are rules for a reason, Mike. Follow them exactly and you'll be fine. Ignore them." He gestured toward the deck above us, where the whispers had been calling my name just minutes before. I pulled the folded paper from my jacket pocket and read through the rules again. They didn't seem like superstitions anymore. They felt like a survival manual written by people who'd learned through terrible experience what lived in these waters. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have listened." "Yeah, you should have." Cap's voice was hard but not unkind. "Question is, are you going to listen from now on, or am I going to have to find another crew member when we get back to port?" I looked at the rules again, then at Cap's old, worn face. Whatever was under the ocean was real, and it was dangerous. But Cap had been dealing with it for 20 years, following these same steps, and he was still alive. The rules worked as long as you were strict about following them. "I'll listen," I said. Cap nodded and checked his watch one more time. "Good. We've got another hour and 15 minutes before it's safe to go back up there. I suggest you use that time to memorize every word on that paper." He was right. The rules weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were the difference between coming home and becoming another missing person report. I'd learned that the hard way, but at least I'd learned it with someone there to save me. I spent the remaining time until 5 a.m. reading and rereading those 5 simple rules, trying to remember everything. When Cap finally opened the hatch and declared it safe to return to deck, the ocean looked completely normal again, just dark. Water under a fading moon with no sign of the horror that stayed beneath the surface. But I knew it was still down there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to look at the water between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. The morning after my encounter with the transformed ocean, Cap sat me down at the small table in the main cabin and spread out a manila folder I'd never seen before. My hands still shook slightly when I thought about those massive teeth grinding beneath our boat. And the look on Cap's face told me he had more to explain than just proper fishing protocols. "Yesterday, you asked why I do this work," he said, opening the folder. "Time you understood what you're really dealing with out here." The first document he pulled out was a Coast Guard incident report from 3 years ago. A commercial fishing vessel called the Sarah Ann had been found drifting 40 miles west of Newport. Engines still running, all safety equipment in place. No crew aboard, no signs of struggle or emergency. The boat had simply been found empty, as if 3 experienced fishermen had all decided to step off the deck and disappear. Cap handed me another report, then another. The Morning Star found floating with a full net still hanging from its winch. The Pacific Dream found with breakfast still warm on the galley table and coffee brewing in the pot. 12 boats over the past 15 years, all in roughly the same fishing grounds we were working now, all found empty with no explanation. Every one of these captains thought they knew better, Cap said, tapping the stack of papers. Thought the old stories were just fishermen talking. Some of them probably got curious about things they shouldn't have looked at. Others likely figured they could bend the rules just a little. I picked up one of the reports and read through the details. The officer who investigated noted that personal belongings weren't touched. Money was still in crew quarters, and there were no distress calls or emergency signals. 3 men had simply disappeared from a boat floating in calm seas. "How long have you known about this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. 20 years next month." Cap pulled out his old watch and checked the time, even though it was only mid-morning. I was working for a captain named Frank Morrison when I learned about the rules. He handed me the same piece of paper I gave you, told me to follow every word or find another job. Cap's expression grew distant as he continued. I thought Frank was losing his mind. Old Salt, who'd been at sea too long, you know. But he'd been fishing these waters for 30 years without losing a single crew member. Other boats working the same grounds lost people regularly. But Frank always brought everyone home. He gathered their ports and put them back in the folder. Frank learned the rules from his captain, who learned them from his captain before that. Goes back generations, passed down from one fisherman to another, the only reason any of us are still alive. I thought about the voices I'd heard whispering my name from beneath those impossible teeth. They had sounded so urgent, so convincing. If Cap hadn't grabbed me, when he did, would I have climbed over that rail? Would the Maria's dream have been found empty a few days later? Just another incident report in someone else's folder. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have believed you from the start." "Yeah, you should have." Cap's voice carried no anger now, just the weight of too much experience. "But you're not the first crew member to test the rules, and you probably won't be the last. Difference is, you're still here to learn from it." He stood up and put the folder away, locking it in a cabinet I hadn't noticed before. "The important thing is what you do from here on. These rules aren't suggestions, Mike. They're the only thing standing between us and whatever's living in these waters." That night, when Cap disappeared below deck at exactly 2:00 a.m., I joined him without being asked. We sat in the main cabin listening to that static-filled radio while the boat moved through the forbidden hours above us. I understood now why Cap looked exhausted every morning. Those 3 hours felt endless when you knew what was happening outside, when every sound from the deck could be footsteps or claws or something worse. Cap dozed in his chair, but I stayed awake and alert. Part of me wanted to sneak up to the deck again to see if the ocean would transform the same way it had the night before. I really wanted to look at something I knew I shouldn't see. But every time I felt the urge, I thought about those missing person reports and forced myself to stay put. At 5:00 a.m. exactly, Cap checked his watch and turned off the radio. "Safe to go back up," he said, though he moved slowly and seemed very tired. When we emerged onto the deck, everything looked perfectly normal. The ocean reflected the early morning light. Seabirds called from somewhere in the distance, and our wake trailed straight and white behind the boat. No sign of the horror that had been just beneath the surface a few hours earlier. 3 days later, while we worked near sunset, sorting through our latest catch, the boat's engine suddenly changed pitch. The steady noise that had become background sound over the past week changed to a higher tone, then stabilized again. But something felt different about our movement through the water. I looked up from the net I was untangling, trying to figure out what had changed. The engine sounded fine. Our speed seemed normal, but the feeling of forward motion had stopped completely. We were floating in place, neither going forward nor drifting backward as if something was holding us. My first instinct was to check the engine room or look over the side to see if we'd snagged something on the ocean floor. But then I remembered Rule 3. If the boat stops moving for no reason, remain calm and continue working. I forced myself to keep sorting fish, fighting the urge to investigate. Cap hadn't even looked up from his own work. He continued putting fish into different containers, checking sizes and species with the same careful attention he'd shown all week. His movements were slow and steady, like someone who'd been through this before. The only sign that he knew something was wrong was how he kept glancing at his watch. Every minute or so he'd check the time, nod slightly to himself, and return to sorting fish. I tried to act as calm Ashim, focusing on untangling lines and organizing our catch. Time passed very slowly. The boat stayed perfectly still while the ocean moved around us, waves passing underneath without moving us at all. It seemed like we were stuck in place by something I couldn't see. He kept working, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Everything I knew about fishing told me to check our equipment, test our engines, or at least look around to see what was holding us. But seeing Cap stay calm helped me focus on my tasks, trusting that following the rules was more important than following my gut. After a long time, Cap checked his watch one final time and nodded. "Minutes, exactly," he said, like he'd been counting. Right when he spoke, he felt the boat move forward. Our normal movement through the water started again right away. The engine sound stayed the same, but we were definitely moving again, going through waves at our usual speed. Cap looked at me and gave a quick nod. "Good job following protocol," he said, then went back to work like nothing had happened. I stared at him for a moment, then at the ocean around us. Everything looked normal now. Just another evening on the Pacific with nothing to show we'd been stuck in place by something for exactly 10 minutes. But I knew what had happened, and I knew that Cap's timing wasn't a coincidence. As we continued working, as the light faded, I realized that these weird events weren't rare or one-time things. They happened regularly out here, following patterns that Cap had learned through 20 years of watching carefully. The rules weren't just protection against the occasional strange event. They were instructions for surviving in waters where impossible things happened all the time. The boats stopped moving, sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. Things knocked on cabin doors during the forbidden hours. Women walked on water and creatures attacked from below. All of it was real. All of it was dangerous, and all of it could be survived by following 5 simple rules. I pulled the folded paper from my jacket pocket and read through the list again, now understanding that each rule came from someone's horrible experience. People had paid a terrible price to learn what happened when you look to the water between 2 and 5 a.m. Someone else had found out what happens when you answer mysterious knocks on cabin doors. The rules existed because people before had made fatal mistakes, and their experiences had become these 5 lines of important instructions. Cap was right. The rules were the only thing keeping us alive in this cursed stretch of ocean, and following them exactly was the difference between coming home and joining the crew of another empty boat found drifting in Pacific waters. The days after the boat mysteriously stopped felt different. I found myself watching Cap more carefully, noticing how he handled each task like someone who knew exactly what could go wrong and when. Every routine seemed planned, every timing on purpose. I started checking my own watch more often, though I couldn't shake the feeling I was always looking for the wrong signs. On our 9th day out, the weather turned nasty around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What had started as scattered clouds became a full storm system rolling in from the northwest, bringing choppy seas and driving rain that stung when it hit bare skin. Cap changed our course to ride with the swells rather than fight them, and we worked together to tie down anything that could move or break loose. I was coiling rope near the stern when I noticed something wrong with the water pattern ahead of us. Through the rain and spray, there seemed to be an area where the waves weren't behaving like they should. Instead of the wild churning you'd expect in a storm, the surface looked almost smooth in one spot, like a path had been cleared through the rough water. That's when I saw her. A figure in white was walking across the water toward our boat, moving with calm, steady steps that never hesitated or adjusted for the rolling waves beneath her feet. She wore a long dress that flowed around her legs but somehow never got wet, never stuck to her body the way soaked fabric should. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, completely dry despite the heavy rain that was soaking everything else. My first instinct was to call out, to tell Cap that someone was in the water and needed help, but Rule 4 suddenly came to mind. If you see a woman in white dress walking on water, go below deck immediately. I dropped therapy and headed for the cabin hatch, moving as fast as I could without running. "Cap," I called as I reached the wheelhouse. "We need to get below deck right now." He looked at me, then looked where I was looking toward the approaching figure. His face went pale, but he didn't ask questions or pause. He hit the autopilot, grabbed a handheld radio from its bracket, and went to the cabin hatch. We both went down the ladder quickly, and Cap secured the hatch behind us like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "How close was she?" he asked, checking his watch. "Maybe 50 yards and getting closer." Cap nodded and moved around the cabin, checking that all the windows were latched and pulling down blinds I hadn't noticed before. The small portholes that normally let in light were covered, completely blocking any view of what was happening outside. "Now we wait," he said, settling into a chair with the radio in his lap. "And we don't look outside, no matter what we hear." The storm continued to rage above us, but under the sound of wind and rain, I started hearing something else. Footsteps. On the deck, light but clear, moving from the front of the boat to the back, slowly and carefully. They weren't the heavy boots of someone trying to keep balance on a rocking deck. These steps were soft and exact, like someone taking a casual walk on solid ground. Cap kept checking his watch while the footsteps continued overhead. Sometimes they stopped near one of the covered windows, and I could hear what sounded like gentle tapping on the glass. Not urgent knocking, just soft, patient taps, like someone asking nicely to be let in from the rain. The footsteps moved in a path around the entire boat, stopping at each window and doorway. When they reached the main cabin hatch, I heard the tapping get stronger. Still not aggressive or demanding, but definitely wanting an answer. Cap motioned for me to stay quiet, though my mouth was so dry I doubt I could have spoken anyway. For nearly an hour, the woman walked her path around our boat. Sometimes the footsteps would stop for several minutes, and the silence felt scarier than the sound had been. During those quiet times, I tried hard to hear any hint of what was happening outside, fighting the strong urge to lift one of the blinds and peek at the deck. But I remembered the changed ocean, the huge teeth grinding under our boat, and the voices that had tried to pull me overboard. Whatever was walking around up there wasn't human, no matter how human it looked. The rules were there for a reason, and that reason was probably standing right outside our cabin. Finally, after what Cap's watch confirmed was 57 minutes, the footsteps stopped. We sat in complete silence for another 10 minutes before Cap slowly raised one of the blinds and looked outside. He checked each window carefully before declaring, "It's safe to return to the deck." When we came out of the cabin, the storm had passed as quickly as it had started. The ocean was calm again, with gentle waves under a cloudy but peaceful sky. But the deck showed something else. Wet footprints covered every inch of the surface. Small bare feet that had left clear marks in the wetness from the rain. The footprints followed the exact path I'd heard during that long hour below deck. They circled the wheelhouse, stopped at each window, and were all over the place around the main hatch. After such a long visit, I was surprised nothing had been moved or damaged. Equipment was exactly where we'd left it. Ropes were still tied properly, and our fish from earlier that day was still safe in the hold. She was looking for a way in, Cap said, studying the footprints with the attention of someone reading a map. They always are, but the rules work as long as you follow them exactly. 2 nights later, I learned what Rule 5 was designed to protect us from. We'd finished our evening meal and were sitting in the cabin when something large struck the boat's hull near the waterline. The impact sent vibrations through the entire boat, strong enough to rattle dishes in the galley and move equipment that was supposedly secured. Cap immediately reached for his watch while I tried to figure out what hit us. Before I could think about it, another impact shook the boat. This one from the starboard side, then another from below directly underneath the cabin. Whatever was attacking us was huge, and it was moving around the boat like it knew what it was doing. The impacts became more frequent and violent. I could hear claws scraping against the metal hull, long gouges being drawn across steel plates that should have been too thick to damage. The sound made my teeth ache like fingernails on a chalkboard, echoing through the entire boat. Between the scraping and the impacts came sounds that definitely weren't mechanical. Roars that seemed to come from something with lungs the size of oil drums. Sounds that carried notes too low and too high for human hearing, but somehow reached me anyway. The sounds made me feel deep instinctive fear. "Robert's quarters," Cap said, standing up from the table. Rule 5. Now we moved to the captain's personal cabin. Cap locked the door behind us and checked that the single porthole was not only covered, but secured with additional latches I hadn't seen elsewhere on the boat. The attacks continued outside, now focused on different parts of the hull as whatever was down there tested our defenses. The scraping got more intense, and I noticed that the creature was actually breaking through the outer hull plates. Metal was being torn away with sounds like steel being ripped apart, but the damage seemed to stop at the inner hull, as if the boat had been specifically designed to handle this kind of attack. "How long does this usually last?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Cap checked his watch again. 5 minutes, he said. Always exactly 5 minutes. Never longer, never shorter. As if answering his words, the attacks got even worse. The whole boat shook each time something hit it, and the roaring got so loud I felt it in my chest. The scraping now sounded like many sets of claws working together, checking every outside surface for weak spots. But at exactly the 5-minute mark, according to Cap's watch, everything stopped. The silence came so suddenly that my ears rang in the quiet. No more hits, no more scraping, no more strange roars, just the normal creaking of a boat at sea and the distant sound of waves against the hull. We waited another 10 minutes before Cap unlocked the door and took us back to the main cabin. Everything inside looked just like we'd left it, though the boat had clearly taken a beating. When we went on deck the next morning, I saw cuts in the hull that went halfway through steel plates nearly an inch thick. But the damage stopped just short of breaking through to the inside. My previous crew members either ignored the rules or panicked when this happened, Cap said as we examined the claw marks in the morning light. The ones who ignored the rules went outside to investigate. The ones who panicked tried to fight back or make noise. Neither approach worked out well for them. I ran my fingers along one of the gugas, feeling the sharp edges where something incredibly powerful had torn through metal like paper. The marks were too large and too deep to have been made by any creature I could identify, and they covered areas of the hull that should have been impossible to reach from the water. "What happened to them?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Same thing that happened to all those other crews," Cap said. "They're part of the missing person reports now. Boats found empty. No sign of struggle. No explanation for where everyone went." He looked at me with his pale blue eyes. "The difference between coming home and disappearing isn't luck, Mike. It's discipline. Following the rules exactly, every time, no matter how scared you get or how much you want to do something else. That day changed how I understood our situation. The supernatural events weren't random things that might or might not happen during our trip. They were regular, predictable things that Cap had learned through careful watching and tough experience. The rules weren't suggestions for dealing with the occasional weird incident. They were a precise survival guide for traveling through waters where impossible things happened on schedule. I started checking my watch all the time, timing everything from meal breaks to equipment maintenance. I memorized not just the 5 rules, but every detail of how Cap put them into action. When he covered windows, I noted which latches he used and in what order. When he picked hiding places, I studied what made them work well. When he timed events, I copied his exactness and learned to trust the patterns he'd found. The rules worked, but only if you stuck to them exactly and kept your cool when everything inside you screamed to do something else. Staying alive in these waters took more than just knowing what not to do. It took the discipline to fight against your instincts when faced with things that didn't make sense. I got why so many crew members before us had failed. It wasn't enough to believe in the supernatural threats or even to know how to protect yourself. You had to stay calm while claws scratched through your boat's hull and strange voices called your name from the water. You had to stop yourself from helping someone who looked like they were drowning. Even when every part of you wanted to save them, you had to trust in rules that seemed too simple when dealing with things humans weren't supposed to understand. But the rules worked. Cap was living proof of that. And now I was learning to be proof, too. The rules existed because someone figured out how people could survive. Places where we're never supposed to go. I pressed my back against the cabin wall, counting the days in my head for what felt like the 100th time. 13 days we'd been out here, and tomorrow morning we'd start the journey back to Portland Harbor. My hands had stopped shaking when the supernatural events occurred, and I'd learned to check my watch with the same precision Cap showed, but nothing had prepared me for what started happening at 2:30 a.m. on our final night. We'd gone below deck at exactly 2 a.m., following the same routine that had kept us alive for nearly 2 weeks. Cap settled into his chair with the static-filled radio while I found my usual spot near the small table. The white noise filled the cabin, with its familiar protective buzz, and I'd started to relax into what I expected would be another 3-hour wait until dawn. That's when the knocking started. But this wasn't the pattern described in Rule 2. 3 soft knocks followed by silence. This was continuous pounding on the cabin door, aggressive and demanding like someone trying to break through the wood with their bare fists. The sound carried through Thesmal space, drowning out the radio static and making normal conversation impossible. Cap looked at his watch, made a face. In all my time aboard the Maria's Dream, I'd never seen him appear uncertain about anything related to the supernatural schedule. But this knocking was different from what the rules had taught me to expect, and his expression showed he was recalculating, something in his head. Rule 2 says 3 knocks, I said, raising my voice over the pounding. I know what Rule 2 says. Cap adjusted the radio volume, but the static couldn't compete with the violence of whatever was attacking our door. This isn't Rule 2 anymore. The pounding continued without pause, getting louder with each passing minute. I could hear the wood starting to strain under the impacts, creaking in ways that made me think the door might not hold much longer. Cap moved around the cabin, checking latches and securing loose items, but he didn't look as sure of himself as usual. That's when I felt the boat stop moving. The normal feeling of moving through the water disappeared instantly, leaving us floating still while the ocean moved around us. But unlike the previous time this happened when everything stayed calm except for our lack of movement, now the boat began rocking violently from side to side. Something big was moving in the water around us, making waves that slammed into our hull from all sides. Cap checked his watch again. 10 minutes, he muttered, but he didn't sound as sure as he did when this happened before. The knocking on the door got louder, along with new sounds from the deck above us. Footsteps moved quickly across the wooden planks. Not the slow steps of the woman in white I'd heard before, but fast movements that sounded like several people running back and forth. With the footsteps came scratching sounds like claws or fingernails being dragged across the deck. Then I heard the whispers. At first they seemed to be coming from outside the boat, from the wind or the ocean. But they grew louder until I realized they were coming from inside the cabin walls themselves. Many voices talking at once in languages I couldn't understand. All of them sounding urgent. All of them trying to tell me something important. Mike. Cap's voice cut through the chaos of sound surrounding us. Check the windows. I moved to the nearest porthole and carefully lifted the edge of the blind Cap had put up earlier. Through the small opening, I could see the deck lit up by moonlight, and my blood went cold at what I saw. The woman in white was right outside our window. But she wasn't alone. 3 identical figures in flowing dresses stood around the cabin, each one motioning toward the windows with slow, weird movements. Their faces were impossible to see clearly. They got blurry whenever I tried to focus on any details, but they moved together with purpose, like they knew exactly what they were doing. "They're here," I said, dropping the blind back into place. "Multiple women. They want us to come outside." Cap nodded grimly and moved to check the other windows. At each one, he confirmed the presence of figures in white, all of them making the same beckoning gestures, all of them positioned to be visible no matter which direction we looked. The boat shuddered as something massive struck the hull from below. This wasn't the systematic testing I'd experienced during the previous attack. This was a coordinated assault from creatures that seemed to be working together. Multiple impacts shook the vessel simultaneously, accompanied by the familiar sound of claws scraping against steel. But now there were so many claws working at once that the scraping became a continuous shriek of metal being torn apart. They're all happening at the same time, I realized, shouting to be heard over the cacophony. Every rule, every threat. This isn't random. Cap looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something that might have been fear. "Final night," he said. "They always treat this on the final night." The pounding on the door got so loud it didn't seem possible. The wood was definitely getting weaker now, and I could see cracks forming around the hinges. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, speaking my name more and more and promising things I couldn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to hear. The women outside the windows pressed closer to the glass, their gestures becoming more urgent. Their white dresses moved in strange ways, flowing differently than the wind that was now howling across the deck. Through the covered portholes, I could see flashes of their pale skin and flowing hair as they moved together around our shelter. Underneath it all, the creatures attacking the hull were hitting harder and putting the boat a tryst. I could hear rivets popping and metal plates coming apart as claws dug into gaps between steel sheets. The scratches were definitely going deeper than during the last attack. "We need more barriers," I said, fighting to think clearly, despite the overwhelming sensory assault. Cap nodded and went to a storage compartment I hadn't noticed before. He pulled out extra latches and reinforcement plates, tossing half of them to me. "Secure every opening," he called over the noise. "Double-check every lock." We worked together to strengthen the cabin, adding extra security to windows and doors that already looked well protected. Working with my hands helped me stay focused while all the noise and commotion continued around us. The attacks kept coming without stopping. The knocking on the door went on non-stop. The footsteps kept racing across the deck, and the whispers continued their urgent pleas. The women in white kept waving us over, and the creatures below kept tearing apart our hull. But I was getting used to the chaos in ways that surprised me. My hands stopped shaking as I installed the extra latches. My breathing got steady as I checked our security measures again and again. The terror I'd felt during my first weird encounters was still there, but it didn't control what I did anymore. I thought about the rules that had kept us alive. They weren't just safety measures. They tested how well we could stay disciplined under extreme pressure. Anyone can follow simple instructions when things are calm, but sticking to the rules perfectly while supernatural forces attacked every sense took serious mental strength. Cap watched me work, and I caught a look of approval on his face. He moved carefully, even with all the chaos, checking his watch regularly and treating this attack like any normal scheduled event. His calmness gave me something to focus on when the whispers got too loud or the waving figures became too hard to ignore. "How long?" I asked, installing the final reinforcement latch. Cap checked his watch. 2 hours and 18 minutes left. 2 hours. I leaned back against the cabin wall and got ready for the longest wait of my life. The attacks weren't slowing down, and I figured they would keep going until exactly 500 a.m., testing us for every minute we had left of the dangerous hours. The woman outside my window pressed her face against the glass, her features changing and blurring, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. Her mouth moved in words I couldn't hear over the other sounds, but I could read her lips saying my name over and over again. She raised one pale hand and drew shapes on the glass that seemed to glow. I made myself look away and focus on Cap's watch instead. The steady ticking gave me a beat I could follow, counting seconds and minutes instead of listening to the whispers coming through the walls. Time crawled by slowly, but it did move, bringing us closer to dawn and safety with each tick. The creatures below had found new areas to attack, and I could feel parts of the hull starting to weaken. But the damage stayed under control, not quite breaking through to the cabin level. Someone had built this boat to handle exactly this kind of attack, strengthening the important areas while letting surface damage keep the creatures busy. Around 4 a.m., the attacks hit a high point that seemed too intense to keep up. Every supernatural threat we'd seen during our 2 weeks at sea was now here all at once, working together in a way that showed they were smart and planning. But instead of getting overwhelmed, I found myself studying how they attacked and noticing details that might help if we ever faced this again. The knocking followed certain patterns that came back every few minutes. The women moved around the cabin in turns, always keeping at least one of them looking through a window. The whispers came in waves, getting louder before dropping tovery, quiet and starting again. Even the creatures below seemed to follow a plan, focusing on specific parts of the hull before moving to new spots. "They're organized," I said to Cap during a brief lull in.